Hey guys, Grant here. In this one we're going to be upgrading my Crested Gecko terrarium. He's been living in a 20-gallon tall that's just been turned on its side. He's been doing great in there, but I've been wanting to get that upgraded for a little while, get him a little bit more space, and just give us something a little bit bigger to look at. So in this one we're going to be building a full custom terrarium that's going to fit into the corner of one of our rooms. It'll take up about the same amount of space as that one, but it's going to give him a lot more space to climb around in just because it's going to be built to the shape of that corner. So this first bit you're watching is just building that main terrarium box, the actual housing for everything. Most of the structural strength is going to come from that plywood, but we are getting a couple 2x2s just in the corners there as well as on the top and bottom, just to make the sides a little bit easier to connect together. So we've got that back kind of built, got it set up on the table so I could check my math. Got those pieces cut out, glued together for the bottom of the terrarium, and then we're just going to have some extra edges around that base. I won't end up doing these on the top, but since this is going to be the bottom, it'll be holding a bunch of the substrate as well as potentially some water after we seal it. So I wanted to give it a little extra strength for the bottom to hook to, as well as each of those corners so they're not leaking, at least less likely to. So we got those glued, brad nailed in, connected to everything. Then we just needed a piece to put on the bottom. So I got just the square cut out. Instead of trying to do all the math and everything, I just set it on top, lined it up, gave a little extra room on that edge for the extra set of plywood that will be there on the front of the terrarium, and then got that glued and brad nailed into place as well. On this one we're going to be using the pond shield to seal this plywood terrarium. You can see in the background there I did a little test build with that tiny paludarium back there. That worked pretty good, so we're hoping it goes well on this new bigger terrarium. This won't necessarily be holding water, but it is going to be humid. We're going to be misting it down. Usually end up with some water hanging out in the bottom of the terrarium. And at the very least we want this to be humid proof so that plywood lasts as long as possible. Now this pond shield is a 2-part epoxy, so I'm trying to just gauge in this about a 50-50 ratio, get that mixed in, and then you can actually thin it out with a little bit of alcohol. That way it's easier to paint on. So I've got the back and the bottom of this terrarium put together. Obviously we're going to need some paneling on top as well as in the front edge there, but I knew this was going to be the easiest way to get everything painted that's on right now. Make sure that's all sealed up good. So I got this poured on. It's obviously a little bit thicker, but you want to make sure you have a nice layer of this coating the entire thing. It's actually the thickness of this that essentially builds a new layer of material on that plywood, and that's what's going to be what keeps it waterproof. Now that we've got everything covered pretty well, we're going to put some fiberglass seam tape on the bottom of this. Typically this is going to add strength to the corners so the edges don't pull apart. Since we have the 2x2s down there, that's not specifically what I'm worried about with this. With the fiberglass tape there, it gives the epoxy a little bit more to hang on to and seep into, which is obviously going to help keep it a lot more waterproof. So we gave that about 24 hours to dry. I stood it up on its edge so all the epoxy would kind of run down if there was any extra, kind of seal the bottom in a little bit more since that's what we're most worried about. We did get a small leak out this back corner, but that works well because now I know that's sealed. We just got that bottom paneling put on. That on the bottom and that front edge is not going to be sealed with that epoxy because I ran out, but I did get that spray painted really good so it's got some coating, but it'll be kind of interesting to see how that holds up versus the rest of it. So we're just getting this cross beam on the top, getting that top paneling cut out so we have that top edge ready to go. Then we're just going to add a little bit of front paneling just like we did on the bottom. That way we've got a little cover for the light when we put that in the top and it's not like shining straight out on your face at all. If you can't tell, I just got the compressor and the brad nailer, so I'm enjoying using that a lot. Makes things a lot simpler. But with those brad nails, they do leave those small little holes, so I got just a little bit of wood filler. You just kind of press those in, scrape off as much as you can, and then we'll go back and you end up sanding that. The next bit here, we're just going to build the base. Going to be essentially the same dimensions, just a little bit shorter. I made this about 2 feet tall. The terrarium is about 4 feet tall, so total the whole thing stands about 6 feet, which I felt like was a pretty good height for everyone viewing. So we had to get that wood filler all sanded down so there's as little amount as possible. And on the outside of this, I decided to use a black stain. I just decided on that because I wanted a little bit of the wood grain coming through, but I didn't want it to be just all natural wood. I didn't think that fit in our place super good. The darker kind of color I felt would fit best in that corner, and it was going to be sitting next to the piano, and that's black as well. So with this stain, you just kind of wipe it on and then rub as much off as you can. You can see it kind of seeps into the softer parts of the wood and then leaves the harder parts not quite as stained. So I ended up liking this look. It's not 100% my favorite, but I felt like it was a good first test on this, and it looks pretty good. So we've got the top and the bottom down. With that stain, I did also put an exterior coat of polyurethane on it. You just do a couple coats of this, sanding in between, that way you get a really smooth finish. And this puts kind of almost a plastic on the outside that helps a lot with waterproofing, as well as like the scuffs and bumps that happen while you're moving it around and those types of things. So it's kind of self-leveling, so just put a thin coat on everything, let that dry for a few hours, came back, sanded, and did that a couple times. Now, one of the parts I know a lot of you came for, the actual interior build. For the inside, I just used some pink foam board. Put one big sheet along the back, and then just put a couple random sheets on the center to build up a little bit more terrain and texture on it. And then to fill in kind of the gaps, get a little extra different look on it, I used some black foam sealant, filled in that back corner as well as around some of those edges. And then we're going to come back through, we're going to use like a wire brush to kind of rip up some of that foam, give it a little bit more of a natural look. I've done just the pink foam before, kind of ripped that up, came back, painted over it. I think that adding this black spray foam before you do that added a lot of texture and looks for it. So I would definitely recommend doing a little bit of mix of both just to get a little bit more of a complete look. Once you give that some time to dry, I go back through with a wire brush. This is going to kind of rip up some of that foam, give it a little bit more natural look. Obviously you don't want it to be completely flat in there. So you run through that. I ripped up a lot of it, kind of pulled out some deeper holes, at least scratched a bit of it. And then I'll go back through with either a heat gun or a hair dryer. This kind of melts that foam, because with the wire brush you end up leaving a lot of like little loose fibers on it. This will kind of melt it, pull it back, tighten it up. That way it's easier to paint over. For painting this, I'm just going to use Drylock, kind of a concrete waterproofer. Just have the white and you can tint it. So I get this poured into a little mixing jar and I'll add a little concrete tint. This one's been sitting a little while and I did not shake it. Make sure, even if you buy it from the store, you give those a good shake before you get those added in. Then when you get them added, you'll actually get the right color. So we do a couple layers of this. I'm going to do kind of a dark, almost black layer. I guess it's more of a light gray. But we're going to cover the entire thing, really get it on to the nooks and crannies and everything like that. Make sure there's no like pink showing through. This is just going to be the natural base coat of kind of the general color you want everything to be. And then I'm going to come back through with another coat of a bit lighter, and I'm just going to brush this on really lightly. This is going to hit kind of just the highlights on that foam board. Going to bring it out, make it look a little bit more 3D so you can see that looks a little more rocky. Then I decided to come back through and hit where I'd done that black spray foam. Hit that with just a little bit of red so you get kind of more of a viney look with those. And I think it ended up turning out really well. Gave that some time to dry, and then I got some hardscape and spray foamed some small planter pots in. I didn't really film this. This is pretty dull to watch. You got to screw around with the hardscape. Make sure you like it. Rearrange. Try a bunch of different things. The nice thing with the foam is that with these branches or whatever you use as a hardscape, you can push those into the foam. It'll kind of hold it there as you foam a little bit more in. So you can see I foamed around some of those end points of the sticks and branches and then pulled kind of some of the foam off, painted those, made those look like they fit in a little bit more naturally. Then I like to add those planter pots just to give bigger plants that I want to plant up there a little bit more substrate to grow in. Now that we've got that done, we've got to get the door cut out. I just grabbed a piece of plexiglass. I'll cut that down to size. To cut that, grab a little knife. You run that along the edge. I like to do it along both sides and line it up as best I can. That seems to give me the best cut. Essentially what you're doing is cutting away a small amount of material every time you score that. That way it cracks along that line where you'd like it to. So once you get that done, I get that pressed down up against the flat edge of the desk, give it some solid downward pressure, and just pop that on that joint that you made. Then voila, you got your door panel. I decided to build just a small frame around the outside of that plexiglass, so I just cut down some of the plywood. Obviously screwing it together like this isn't going to be that strong, especially having to cut those screws down because they're a little bit long. But we'll get this down. I built these so that the plexiglass would fit right inside each of these brackets on each of the corners. I got that stained so it's going to match the outside of the terrarium as well. Then we're just going to get this siliconed in. That's what's really going to hold this door together. Since that's going to be the main structural component of this, I'm making sure I get plenty of silicone on this, making sure that connects to the plexiglass as well as the door frame itself. Then to actually get this attached, I decided I was going to just use magnets, so I'll drill out some small holes in the terrarium as well as the door. Just put a magnet in each side, that way they connect when you shut it. It's going to hold it from the top and bottom. This entire door will kind of pop off, leaving the front of it really wide open. That way it's easy to get in and out, work with, and really this doesn't need to be opened that much. And with just the Crested Gecko in there, those magnets will be plenty strong to hold it together and keep everything inside. But you can see that snaps into place really nicely. Since filming this, I have had to re-glue those magnets back in. So if you're going to build something like that, make sure you get that super glue on the back as well as along the outside edges of each of those magnets, and then they'll actually stay put. Now you don't have to put a hole in the bottom of your perfectly sealed terrarium. I'm doing this so I can put a bulkhead here and then put a little drain out the bottom. I've had this in my last terrarium. It's been super nice. That way I don't have to worry about overwatering or anything, because if you do, you just pull this drain off the bottom, it drains out. Obviously you're putting a hole in the bottom of the terrarium that might end up leaking, and you also don't want it to leak into the plywood. So I'm making sure that I get this bulkhead sealed on the top. Afterwards, we're just going to build a little shutoff valve. It's going to be pretty simple, just a little PVC put into an adapter that will screw onto that bulkhead. Then I just put on a ball valve just right on the end of that PVC, and that's going to work well enough. That'll be the first part that kind of fills up, and if I ever need to, I can just put a bucket underneath that and pull that valve and drain it. But you can see that's how it screws into that bulkhead that's already in. So that's pretty simple. We got that installed. You can see that's underneath. You can just pop that, nice and easy. Drain out the substrate and that drainage layer. Now that we've got the hole in the bottom fixed, we're ready to put a hole in the top of the terrarium. It's just going to be for a small fan. It's going to pull air in and out just to keep things fresh so it doesn't get stagnant. I essentially just drilled a bunch of holes in a bigger circle and then pounded on it till that came out. Used a Dremel and kind of smoothed those edges up so it was a little bit cleaner. After we got that looking just a little bit nicer, I used one of the protectors from the fan, screwed that in the top. That way the top's still sealed, nothing can climb out there. And I got screws put in from the bottom. That way the fan is mounted securely and it'll make a lot less noise when it turns on. Now even with that grate installed inside the terrarium, I did still decide to put a little bit of mesh in between that and the fan. Didn't want any tails or little hands or anything like that coming from the inside of the terrarium up into the fan blades. So we got that installed, put the little pads on so that'll help make it a little quieter as well. And then just had to knock that fan on. It was a little tight, so took a little bit of pushing. But once that was on, plugged that in, made sure it was pulling air out. That worked great, so we got it bolted on and secured. Now we just need to put one more hole in this terrarium. I'm sure plenty of you are wondering if it would have just been easier to do all this before I'd finished it, and it probably would have, but I can't think that far ahead. So we just need this one more hole for somewhere for the light to go. So we actually ended up using this to route the fogger in as well, so it worked good, but I had to make the hole a little bigger than the cord. That way I could fit that little control box through for the light as well. I ended up just spray painting that so it doesn't look so bad. And that should be all the holes we need to put in this terrarium. Now on to the planting and substrate of this one. For the drainage layer, we're going to use Leca in this. They're basically just little clay pellets that are going to have plenty of space for water to drain into them. In any sort of terrarium, you're going to want to make sure you have a drainage layer. This essentially allows water to go out of the substrate and sit in something else so that substrate isn't molding. I did use a window screen mesh to create kind of a barrier between the substrate and drainage layer. That way they don't end up mixing. Now for the substrate on this one, the base is going to be kind of a sphagnum moss. I have some of this compacted sphagnum moss, so I had to break that up and then just add some water. That way it could rehydrate. The sphagnum moss is really going to hold a lot of moisture in the terrarium, which is obviously what we want for a crested gecko. Then I just added some bark That's going to end up breaking down, as well as I'm adding some cocoa fiber and getting that all mixed in. We're also going to add just some activated carbon. This is going to help add some chemical filtration, fight some bacteria, pull some other things out of anything that's in that terrarium that we don't want. Then I'm just adding some black sand, which essentially looks the same, but just to add some consistency and a little more texture to that substrate. Next, we're going to add some springtails. If you're not familiar with these, they're essentially just little bugs that are going to eat a lot of the mold that grows inside the terrarium. Very essential for a bioactive scape, just going to take care of a lot of things for you. I'm also adding just a little bit of the activated carbon as a base layer underneath the substrate before we throw that in. That way all the water that goes up and down through that will be passing through that. Then we're just getting kind of a thick layer of substrate. Want plenty of spaces for the roots to grow. Plants will have down in here, and a lot of space that is going to hold moisture as well. Then we're just going to get those planter pots filled up, as well as put a little substrate in all the little nooks and crannies of the background. Then we're going to have a few different plants. Our base plant in the bottom is going to be a bromeliad. We've got this Phytonia, and neon pothos will go up towards the top. And we've got a couple small things, just a little fern, as well as some runner plants that'll hopefully fill in nicely. Now to get these added safely, we're going to want to take off as much dirt out of those roots as we can. So I just filled this bucket with water and kind of rinsed off those roots so you're not getting any of that dirt or fertilizer. Put this bromeliad in the bottom. Well, hopefully it's going to get enough light down there. Then we grab this Phytonia, put it in that little pot, or kind of press it down in the roots, so just making sure it's get enough moisture. Got a little fern in that other pot. Then we added some of this little runner plant. I'll put the name up on screen. I forget what it is. Kind of push that in. We ended up adding that in a few more spots, just so it fills out a little bit more. Then we got this neon pothos up in the top. And that'll about do it for all our regular plants. We are going to get some moss in here. I grabbed just a little starter pack off Amazon. It's got a bunch of different types of mosses in it. So this way we can kind of experiment with each one, see which grows the best. So you can see we've kind of got like a pincushion moss, a couple other mosses. I'll get their names up on screens because obviously I don't know what they are right offhand. But we got those pushed down in a bunch of different places down in the bottom, as well as up into the wall. So I feel like that really brings it full circle when you get that moss in there. Gives it a nice full look for sure. So we gave all the plants a nice spray down, made sure they were nice and humid so they weren't drying out inside that terrarium. Then we're just going to get this lid on. We'll give it a couple weeks to kind of grow out before we throw the Crested Gecko in there. Let the roots kind of set up before anything starts climbing on them. Even right now, not grown in, I think everything ends up looking pretty good. So we'll see how things do in the coming weeks, and we'll check back in then. Alright guys, it's been about 2 months. Gave it about a month to grow out, and then we got Link in there. Link's the Crested Gecko, of course. You can see here we've got a little bit of dieback for sure. That fern, not loving it, not sure quite what's going on there. Did well for the first couple weeks and then recently started going. Phytonia's doing pretty okay. This bromelia that's down here in the bottom, I think it's just not quite getting enough light. So we're giving that a little bit more time to see how it does. I've added just a little bit of like an aquarium fertilizer underneath there, which seemed to help a little bit. But you can see a lot of those leaves are kind of getting wilted, and I think a lot of it has to do with just not quite enough light down in the bottom. So we'll go ahead and pop this front off so we can get you a little closer view of everything. I realized I never quite showed you guys how this light hooks up, but we just got some command strips, hooked that light up straight to the ceiling. That hole right there is actually for a fogger that I got hooked up. So that runs for 5 minutes every 2 hours. Then that fan kicks on 4 times a day for about 5 minutes as well. That fogger is actually for 10 minutes a day, just to keep the humidity levels up. I do still have to mist it down every couple days, just because the plants need actual water, and Link drinks from the droplets. But overall, it's turned out well. Obviously, we may need to revisit a couple of the plants, but that's pretty normal. So we'll see how it continues to do, and we'll get you updates in the future. So thanks for watching.